It gives me great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker. Dr. Valerie Wilson serves as director of the Economic Policy Institute's program on race, ethnicity, and the economy. Her team's work has been a nationally recognized source of nonpartisan research and analysis for those who want to better understand the economic condition of America's people of color. Her work is part of the Economic Policy Institute's groundbreaking efforts to center the needs of low and middle income workers in economic policy discussions. Much like our own work here at OK Policy, EPI provides data and analysis to move forward the idea that every working person deserves a good job with fair pay, affordable health care, and retirement security. A noted expert on issues of economic inequality in the United States, Dr. Wilson has written extensively on issues that include employment and training, income and wealth disparities, access to higher education, and social insurance. Prior to joining EPI, Dr. Wilson was an economist and vice president of research at the National Urban League Washington Bureau. It is my honor to welcome Dr. Valerie Wilson to the program.
Good afternoon, everyone. I guess it's still morning in Oklahoma. Thank you, Shiloh, for that very generous introduction. And thank you to OK Policy for the invitation to speak at this year's State Budget Summit and Advocacy Training. I also want to extend greetings, thanks, and well wishes to Executive Director Rose in her absence. Now, I know OK Policy as a strong partner in EPI's EARN network, as well as a member of our EARN in the South cohort. But I'm going to suggest that recently I've discovered that I think an even stronger testament to the work that you do and the reach and influence of your organization is the fact that word of my participation in today's event reached my mother in Houston, Texas, before I even had a chance to mention to her that I was going to be doing this. You may be asking, well, what's that have to do with anything? I know that the folks at OK Policy had no idea that I actually have family in Oklahoma. And I don't think anyone outside of my immediate family really knows what it is I do for a living. So the fact that your promotional materials for today's event spread through the community and made its way to the family grapevine with such efficiency, I think speaks volumes about your organization's outreach and communications mechanism, though. So kudos on that. And now that you all know I'm not a complete stranger to the state of Oklahoma, even though I currently work in the Washington, D.C. area, I am in fact a native Texan. So let me begin by extending a heartfelt hey y'all to everyone joining us today, and in particular to any of my family members who may be online. You heard in the introduction that both OK Policy and EPI share a similar mission. That mission is rooted in the desire to inform and empower individuals to seek solutions that ensure broadly shared prosperity and opportunity. Now, that may mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But when you understand that the bottom 80% of all non-elderly households in this country receive the vast majority of their income by working, it really boils down to one basic imperative. And that's that every working person needs and deserves a good job with fair pay, affordable health care, and retirement security. But unfortunately, we all know that far too few workers know this as their reality. And that fact alone is one of the major symptoms of economic or class inequality in this country. That's a problem that EPI has been working to expose and resolve for about 35 years now. But it's also a symptom of racial inequality. So my work at EPI as a labor economist and director of our program on race, ethnicity, and the economy, which we affectionately call PRE, involves using the tools of economic analysis to to explain how race, ethnicity, gender, and class all intersect to affect economic outcomes in the United States. But also, my work involves using that information to develop policy solutions that help to narrow these gaps and get all working families closer to the goal of broadly shared prosperity and opportunity. The fact is, class inequality and racial inequality are inextricably intertwined. Racism is baked into class inequality. Your race influences where you live, how much you earn, whether or not you get hired, where your children go to school. But it's also true that racial inequality exists within class. Now, I'll talk a bit more about that as I get into some of the specific stats and figures that I want to share with you today. The evidence on racial economic disparities in the United States is clear. Those disparities are large. We observe them across class, gender, age, and education. And they have literally persisted over generations in this country. That includes racial gaps in unemployment, in wages, in income, in poverty, in wealth, in education, in health status, and the list goes on and on. Now, all of these inequalities can be traced to policy choices, including failure to enact needed policies. That's also a choice. I understand that my job largely is to define the problems and recommend the solutions. But we all know that policy choices come with price tags and are constrained by budgets. And your job, many of you, is to figure out how to pay for these solutions and bright ideas that folks come up with to resolve the problems. But I also want to make clear that we also have to understand that while policies come with a price tag, a cost, can be constrained by budgets, inequality also comes with a cost. It costs us economically, it costs us socially, and it even costs us politically as well. Unfortunately, inequality also can come with a cost of one's life, as we've seen through the COVID crisis, as we've seen through racial unrest and unfortunate, horrifying incidences of police brutality and violence against Black lives and other marginalized communities in this country. And so what we do about economic inequality and racial inequality speaks volumes about what and who we value as a society. Now, prior to the COVID-19 crisis, the US was experiencing the longest period of economic expansion in history. Let's think about that. Yet, on the heels of that record expansion, record low unemployment, the ever-present legacy of racism and economic inequality was laid bare literally in a matter of days or weeks. That legacy was predictive of the needlessly heavy burden that COVID-19 has imposed on communities of color. And that is a reality that every state in the nation must confront as we work toward recovery and rebuilding a post-COVID economy that truly works for all. So that's the framework that I want to use for most of my remarks today as I talk about policy imperatives for racial and economic justice. I'm going to discuss the evidence of the racially disparate economic impact of COVID-19, the pre-existing economic insecurity that has made the pandemic and the related job losses especially devastating for communities of color, and then align those facts with some of the policy priorities that OK Policy has outlined. The way that I like to frame my understanding of the COVID-19 recession and its impact is this. The COVID-19 recession basically sorted workers into three main groups. The first group is obvious. It's the tens of millions of folks who lost their jobs, and as a result of that, face great economic insecurity. The second group is another that we've heard a lot about in the last several months. Those are the essential workers who face greater health risks, even though they have maintained some degree of job security. And the third group of workers are those who have been able to continue working from the safety of their homes, like me and many of us on this meeting today. Generally, for the most part, keeping their economic security and health security intact. When we think about how this plays out by race and ethnicity, we know that Black, Latino, Native American, and low-income workers are least likely to be in that last group. And so those are the groups that are facing few good options to protect both their health and economic well-being. Now, each of the groups I just named, of course, share similar experiences that make them more susceptible to death and the economic devastation that have resulted from COVID-19. But in the interest of time, I don't have hours and hours to dig deeply into the specifics for every group. My remarks today will draw largely from a report I co-authored with my colleague, Elise Gould, titled Black Workers Face Two of the Most Lethal Pre-Existing Conditions for COVID-19, Racism and Economic Inequality. I want to cite the research from that report in the interest of illustrating the extent of inequality. And I think that provides a very clear example because when we look at Black-white inequality in this country, per our national statistics, we can see the longest and consistently documented record of racial inequities. And I say consistently documented. We don't do a good job of documenting inequities for a number of groups in this country, I think including Native communities. So that's a discussion for another day, another policy that we need to really invest more in our data collection, data reporting processes so that we do have a clear and consistent picture of all the challenges that communities face in this country and can do a better job of designing policy to address those things. Now, what we have observed time and time again is that prior economic insecurity actually magnifies any immediate economic shock and the resulting damage that does to workers and their families. The significant long-standing racial gaps in employment opportunities, in wage levels, translate into lower incomes for those workers and their families, less savings, and higher poverty rates, in particular among people of color relative to white households, making those job losses during the pandemic especially devastating in those communities. I'll talk a bit first about the record on unemployment and pay gaps, which really are the foundation, again, for strengthening the majority of households in this country who, as I said before, receive most of their income through working. One of the most defining features of the US labor market is the large and persistent disparity in unemployment that exists between Black and white workers. Historically, Black workers have faced unemployment rates that are twice as high as those of their white counterparts. Even when overall unemployment rate averaged about 3.7% in 2019, among the lowest unemployment rates on record, we observed a white unemployment rate of 3%, also among the lowest on record, and a Black unemployment rate of 6.1%, which was twice as high. The 6.1% was also the lowest on record for African Americans. But that 2-to-1 disparity existed even in what we may call the best of times. This disparity is observed on average overall, but we also observe this same or very similar 2-to-1 disparity for all age cohorts, at every level of education, and for men and women alike. Again, this speaks to the persistence of that disparity in this country across time, across demographics. Another defining feature of racial inequality in the labor market are the large disparities in pay between Black and white workers. And I will remind you that racial pay gaps, like these unemployment disparities, persist even after accounting for factors commonly associated with individual productivity. So things like education or skills that people will often point to explain why wages may vary between workers and are an explanation for why wages vary by workers. But again, after controlling for those things, we continue to observe these racial disparities. And in fact, these wage gaps, racial wage gaps, have in fact gotten worse over the last 40 years, rather than actually improving as more of the workforce becomes more educated. These significant gaps in both employment opportunities and wage levels translate, as I mentioned before, into lower incomes and higher poverty rates. In 2019, for example, the median Black household earned just 61 cents for every dollar of income that the median white household earned. That 61 cents on the dollar also is incredibly persistent. We can go back 50 years, and that ratio has been about 60%. Sometimes it's 58, 59, sometimes it's 62, but about in that 60% range for the last 50 years. Also in 2019, more than 1 in 5 African Americans, compared with 7.3% of whites, lived below the poverty line. And that means that for a family of 4, their annual income was less than $26,000. So 2 of OK Policy's policy priorities, increasing the minimum wage and expanding the EITC, are targeted at raising pay and incomes among low-income workers and therefore alleviating poverty. Those 2 things are important for addressing those issues, and they're important for addressing some of the racial disparities that we observe in those areas. Now, while these policies are sometimes described as alternative or maybe competing options for helping low-income workers, economists Jesse Rawlston and Ben Zipperer have made a rather compelling case for viewing those 2 policies actually as complementary. In other words, a minimum wage increase and EITC expansion are more effective together than either is on its own. Just to cite a few statistics on the effectiveness of those policies, one of the most comprehensive assessments of the effect of minimum wage on family incomes finds that every 10% increase in the inflation-adjusted minimum wage reduces Black and Hispanic poverty rates by about 10.9%. So, had the federal minimum wage kept pace with inflation since 1968, Black and Hispanic poverty rates would be 18.2% lower today. That translates to nearly 3.3 million people, African American and Latino, who would no longer be in poverty. Like the minimum wage, there's a large body of research also around the EITC indicating that it reduces poverty, and that tax credit also helps to improve health and educational outcomes. 2 other issues that are a major concern in the current environment and have been impacted by COVID-19. So increasing the minimum wage and expanding the EITC are policies that will help low-income workers now, but will also put them in a less precarious position when the next crisis strikes. The second group of workers that I mentioned at the beginning were the essential workers. Now, while in the near term, essential frontline workers have been somewhat shielded from job losses, they do, however, face greater likelihood of contracting COVID-19 while performing their jobs because they have to work outside of the home and come in contact with more of the public. Black workers in particular are overrepresented among the group of essential workers. Black workers make up about 1 in 9 workers overall, but about 1 in 6 frontline industry workers. They're also more likely to be uninsured and less likely to have paid sick leave. On average, Black workers are 60% more likely than white workers to be uninsured. That's an uninsured rate of about 12.3% for African Americans compared to 7.5% for whites. Now, those are relatively low rates of uninsurance, and clearly, historically, they're lower rates than we observed before the Affordable Care Act and the various steps to expand Medicaid throughout the states. But less than 60% of Black workers have paid sick leave, and about 67% of white workers. Paid family medical leave, then, as a policy priority is important because it empowers workers to make decisions that protect the health and economic well-being of their families. They're not having to make a choice between one or the other, as we have seen many families have to do in the COVID crisis. And another point I want to make about health policy, paid leave, and Medicaid expansion in particular, is that another outcome of the pandemic, I talked about the job losses. The loss of employment has meant loss of health insurance for tens of millions of workers. And so Medicaid expansion makes healthcare accessible to those who suffer job losses, as well as the low-wage workers who don't receive employer-sponsored health insurance. So both of those policies also are critically important in the current time as we seek to address economic inequality and racial disparities in each of those outcomes. Now, finally, I would be remiss in describing the racially disparate impact of the pandemic without addressing the role of the racial wealth gap. In order to weather a financial loss, families often must dip into their savings to cover their living expenses. But of course, that's only if they have savings, and only if those savings are adequate for them to continue to pay their rent or mortgage and put food on the table in the event of a job loss or a serious health shock. Now, according to the Federal Reserve, in 2019, about 37% of all adults would not have adequate cash reserves to cover an unexpected $400 expense. 37% of all families, regardless of race or ethnicity, or all adults, regardless of race, ethnicity, gender, class, etc. However, again, when we consider the racial dynamics of wealth disparities in this country, we find that white families hold on average more than 5 times as much in liquid assets as Black families do. That's about $50,000 for the typical white family versus less than $9,000 for the typical Black household. Now, clearly, in order to address the racial wealth gap, we must expand opportunities for families to build assets and do so in a way that doesn't penalize low-income families by dramatically reducing their eligibility for other important programs like child care and housing assistance prematurely. But some of the policies that I've discussed thus far, I've talked about increasing the minimum wage, expanding the EITC, Those policies for increasing incomes for low-income families are one step towards putting families in a better position to be able to save some money for the event of an economic downturn, job loss, a health issue. However, I think one of the things that is often overlooked in our discussion of the wealth gap and its significance and OK policy, and in particular, I want to shout out to Damian Shade and his work on this. You all have done an outstanding job of drawing more attention to the various extractive mechanisms like fines and fees and bail that draw disproportionately drain income from communities of color. And that's where criminal justice reform around bail reform and reducing and eliminating fines and fees also becomes crucial in addressing these broader issues of economic insecurity and economic inequality. So in closing, as I wrap this up and try to bring this all together, each of the policies that I have mentioned are seemingly quote unquote race neutral. There's no mention of race or any particular targeting for one group or the other within any of those policies. But it is important for policymakers to recognize that no policy is truly race neutral because they are being applied to a racially stratified social and economic structure. So all policy, regardless of what it is, essentially shapes how the nation's income and wealth will flow, and as a result, how access and opportunity will flow. Equitably shared opportunity and prosperity starts with careful assessment of the social and economic conditions across all affected communities prior and in the process of policy development. But it doesn't end there. We must also closely monitor whether those policies are having the intended effects post-implementation or whether they're having disparate effects along some of the lines that I've discussed. So by centering the needs of those who face the greatest economic harm, I think the overall effectiveness of any policy response is likely to be improved at the same time that it can be used to minimize disparities by race, ethnicity, gender, and class. With that, I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to having a discussion and answering any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wilson. We are so glad that you could be with us today. I'm going to go to, we've got a handful of questions for you here. People have been sharing with us in the chat. First question is, many racial equity efforts focus on making systems more equitable systems to close disparities moving into the future. These often skip over remedies for the existing inequities resulting from generational wealth obstruction. Do you see a role for reparations to remediate past harm?
I absolutely do. I talked about, before I got into talking specifically about bail reform, about asset building, about addressing the asset side of it. And the issue of reparations, I think, is unique because it's both an economic solution to addressing wealth disparities, but it also is a matter of justice, social justice, of truth and reconciliation, of atonement in this country. So I think that is a very important discussion and conversation that we have in this country. And most importantly, that we're all on the same page and understanding what reparations are and what they are not. So that's my answer to that. We absolutely need to consider history in this and resolving things that are yet to be unresolved. And at the same time, those are measures that can be effective in addressing the wealth gap.
Awesome, thank you. The wealth gap is one of my things I preach on regularly. So anybody that knows me knows it's one of those things that really, really does make a significant difference.
And I'll also
go ahead.
Plug a book for anyone interested in learning more about this, William Darity and Kirsten Mullen, From Here to Equality. I think it's one of the most comprehensive books written about making a case for reparations for Black Americans.
Awesome. Thank you for that suggestion. Had to write it down in my notes, so sorry about that. From our Stillwater Together Oklahoma chapter lead, which is OK Policy's grassroots organization, Dr. Wilson, what are the most successful strategies you'd recommend for combating the myth that an increase in the minimum wage is offset by an increase in the cost of necessary goods and services?
Yeah, a lot of these arguments and challenges to the minimum wage, aren't really supported or backed by the evidence. I think the evidence and the research on minimum wage has shown that it is effective at raising wages and raising incomes in a way that can help economic growth. The people who receive an increase in their income as a result of minimum wage are people who are, most often in lower income families to begin with. Those are families that are more likely to spend and use that money often for things that are just necessary goods for their household. So in doing so, that spending actually helps to grow the economy. It actually helps to create other jobs. So it has that kind of multiplying effect in terms of the broader economy. Again, the minimum wage has failed to keep pace with inflation. Failure to increase the minimum wage has resulted in reduced purchasing power for those who are minimum wage workers. So, the argument that somehow it's going to result in inflation, kind of is inconsistent with the fact that it's already far out of sync with rising costs to begin with. So I think it's more important that we focus on the importance of minimum wage, again, at increasing incomes and in building economic security in those families, and the stimulative effects that has on the economy.
Great, thank you. And Robin, thank you for your question. Should there be policies which are not race neutral to address some of these issues?
I think there is a place for policies that aren't race neutral. The question about reparations, that's clearly not a race neutral policy. But again, it is pegged to a specific harm and a solution for a specific problem historically, but also a problem that continues to be an issue. I think the challenge that we often face in the policy space is the issue of whether or not race-specific or race-targeted policies can sort of pass the muster in terms of the law and not being seen as discriminatory policies themselves. But again, there are clearly areas where that will be necessary. I think, as I was mentioning, even if we don't have race-specific policies, we really need to understand how these quote-unquote race-neutral policies will have disparate effects, and design policies that address those issues at the same time. So nothing is ever really race-neutral. Like I said, even if you don't put race in it, there's going to be a disparate effect because the structure is already unequal.
Yeah, and we can see, thanks Mona for the comment there, the policies that created inequality weren't race neutral, so the remedy must be race conscious. So yeah, thank you so much for that. I question now about the EIT, well, around the EITC, we talked about the earned income tax credit and increasing minimum wage. Are there other considerations aside from these two things that would help move toward better equity for all? If so, are these considerations more palatable to legislators?
I think recently there's been a lot of movement, both in terms of the public support for, as well as some lawmakers support and consideration for raising the minimum wage and expanding the EITC. Again, I think the effectiveness of those programs really speak for themselves. And again, going back to the idea that public support is strongly behind it has really, pushed things in the direction of moving them forward. Again, when we're thinking about policies that are going to be the most effective, specifically for workers, because both of those are work-based policies, they don't do much for those who are not working. making sure that every worker, again, in this country is able to have a reasonable and adequate standard of living. Those two are really what I see as some of the most important and far-reaching policies that we can enact at this time to address the economic inequality, but also some of the racial disparities that we see because of where folks fall in the economic hierarchy and structure in this country.
Well, we definitely support that answer. So thank you for that. Another question, what policy could make the most difference in the long run to close the Black employment gap?
So the thing that I think is just foundational to doing that is getting to as consistently as possible full employment economy. What that basically means is that we have a high pressure labor market with really low unemployment. That's really the only time that we see those gaps. Now, again, the ratio doesn't change much, sure, the 2 to 1. But in terms of the absolute difference, about a 3 percentage point difference between Black and white unemployment that we saw in 2019 is much lower than, say, a 10 percentage point difference that we can see during a recession or other periods of when the labor market isn't as strong as it should be. So tight labor markets is extremely important to closing that gap. But in addition to that, we really need to understand why those disparities continue to exist. We can't get around the role that race plays. One of the things that I talk about a lot is that within education disparity, a lot of times we look at the average gap and we assume, well, people need more skills or training or education, and then they'll have better employment opportunities. But that 2 to 1 is at every level of education. Even the most highly educated workers face that 2 to 1 disparity. And I think that speaks specifically to the fact that there is racial discrimination in labor markets, whether it is explicit or overt or covert or just a part of the way that the structure functions. So we really need to understand how we make those opportunities more equitable. We need to do more to strengthen our enforcement mechanisms for tracking discrimination, in particular funding the EEOC adequately, and do those, take those additional steps to narrow the gap beyond just having a strong labor market that provides more opportunities for all workers to be employed.
Another question here, what approaches would be most helpful in increasing wealth versus income?
So yeah, wealth is a matter of net worth. That's how we typically measure it. And that's the difference between your assets, the value of what you own, and your liabilities or debts, what you owe others. So in theory, there are 2 ways to do that. You can increase assets. Some of the things that are being talked about now are programs like baby bonds, where when every child is born, they receive an endowment of money that is income based on the income of the family that can grow over time. And so, when they reach the age of 18, they have access to that money to pay for college, to buy a car, for a down payment on a house, to start a business, any number of things. Those things increase the asset side of the ledger. I think a lot of the work that you all have done on talking about some of the extractive mechanisms, some of the things that draw or create liabilities for families, like fines and fees and unnecessarily high bail, are some of the things that we can address as well. When we think about home ownership, that's another means. The largest asset that most families in this country own is a home. So having adequate access to that, which includes people having the money. I mentioned one of the things that those bonds, baby bonds, may be used for is for a down payment on a home. Making sure that there are programs that help people to make a down payment and to purchase a home if that's what they choose to do, but also addressing the predatory nature of a lot of lenders in this country, and that has also served as an extractive mechanism as people lose their homes or receive subprime mortgages have higher fees and penalties associated with them than would be justified by either one's credit history or income. Those are wealth mechanisms. Income, again, really comes down to addressing labor market inequalities, both in terms of employment and wages, and then the benefits and things that come along with employment as well.
I swear that you're reading my script, because that housing comment leads right into my next question. There's been a lot of discussion in the last few years about historically racist systems, from homeownership to education access, that still play a very active role in the racially disparate outcomes we see today. What tools are available in the budget and tax system to address this?
Oh, that's a good question. Oh, so I don't know that I could point to anything specifically in the budget and tax system. Home ownership, of course, the big thing that people often point to as a tax expenditure or budget expenditure is the mortgage deduction. People can claim on their taxes, and the fact that that tends to be more beneficial to higher income or higher wealth families, and of course that plays out along racial lines as well. So I know that that's something that you get a lot of pushback on when you talk about wanting to sort of scale it back or do away with it, but it is not as progressive perhaps as it could or should be. But otherwise, I think we can't discount the value and importance of regulatory structures in this country. And the fact that when those regulatory structures are not in place, that we tend to see the systems being abused by lenders and the like, in extending credit, the kinds of credit that they extend, and really being able to do that without much penalty at all for the cost that is borne in communities of color in particular.
Thank you. Yeah, that's regulatory and predatory lending, and all of those things go hand in hand. So I appreciate you bringing up the regulatory piece in your answer. This is going to be our final question. What is the most foolproof language we can use to reach across party lines or help friends or family regarding the racial wealth gap and raising the minimum wage?
So the most
foolproof language. So especially in Oklahoma, I know the kind of where they're coming from, right? There's a lot of people who, as soon as you start talking about the racial wealth gap and raising the minimum wage, will shut down.
Yeah. That's always an interesting question, and one that I tend to respond to by saying, again, right is right. I think, again, if we're trying to, sort of broaden our circle of people who will advocate for these things, we have to make it clear that it's not a zero-sum game. That when we have communities in this country who are not fully participating in our economy, are not able to have access to opportunities that allow them to contribute their fullest potential and talents and skills, that we all suffer because the economy is missing things. The society is missing things that we could benefit from as a whole. And so one of the comments that I've heard Reverend Barber make that I think is really telling is that, budgets are moral documents and policies are moral decisions. It says a lot about our values and who we are as a country, that we truly make an effort to make sure everyone can fully participate. And that doesn't exclude or minimize anyone else, but it's important that we recognize that there are folks who are marginalized, who've been exploited, who face discrimination, and that their full participation and full membership in this society is a benefit and a gain to the entire country. So it's not a zero sum. Justice is something that benefits and is of value to all of us.
I know that if we were in person post-pandemic, you would have a big standing ovation to that final comment. That was beautiful. Thank you so much. Thank you for being in Oklahoma with us today, Dr. Wilson. It's been a long challenge of ours to get you here and speak and be a part of State Budget Summit. So we're very, very grateful that you're able to make time for us to be here, and your words just give me goosebumps. So thank you for giving this person who's lived 11 years of her life in OK policy hope. You know, we all need those points where we get reinvigorated and hope. And thank you for giving that to us today. I very much value you and your opinion and your expertise.